I thought my life was normal, simple, predictable. But one text message flipped everything upside down, and what happened next? Well, you're not ready for this. My name's Emma, I'm 20, and if you had asked me last week, I would have said my life was pretty boring. I live with my mom and her husband, Mark, in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Mark isn't my dad, obviously, but we get along. He's polite, distant, the kind of guy who keeps his shoes spotless and his ties always perfectly straight. Mark works for a big corporate firm, the kind where people wear expensive suits and throw around words like synergy and quarterly projections. Every now and then, he brings his colleagues over for dinner, which is exactly what he did last Friday night. That's when I met James. He wasn't like the others. While the rest of Mark's colleagues were stiff and professional, James stood out. He was confident, charming, the kind of guy who knew how to make you feel like the only person in the room. He laughed easily, shared stories that made everyone at the table lean in closer, and he had this smile, like he knew a secret no one else did. I couldn't help but notice how he looked at me during dinner. It wasn't inappropriate, at least not yet. But there was something about the way his eyes lingered a second too long, the way his compliments felt just a little too personal. "I've heard so much about you, Emma," he said, his voice smooth as silk. I just smiled politely, trying to brush it off. I figured he was just being friendly. After all, he was one of Mark's closest colleagues. But deep down, I felt a twinge of unease. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a notification. A message from an unknown number. "Hi, Emma, it's James. I just wanted to say it was a pleasure meeting you last night. You have such a great energy about you." I stared at the screen, my stomach doing a weird little flip. Why was he texting me? How did he even get my number?
James, he replied cautiously.
"Thanks, it was nice meeting you too." His response came almost immediately. "I hope this isn't weird. I just felt like we had a really nice connection. You're very mature for your age." I didn't know how to respond. On one hand, it felt flattering. On the other, something about it didn't sit right. But I didn't want to be rude, so I just sent a polite thanks. What happened next made my heart race. "Can I be honest with you?" he wrote. Before I could even type a response, another message popped up. "I couldn't stop thinking about you after dinner. You're absolutely stunning, Emma." I froze. My mind was racing. Was this really happening? Did he seriously just send that? For a moment, I considered blocking his number, shutting this whole thing down before it could go any further. But then curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see where this was going. So I replied, "That's sweet of you to say, but isn't this a little inappropriate?" His answer was immediate. "Maybe, but I couldn't keep it to myself. You're special, Emma. I felt it the moment I saw you." My pulse quickened as I stared at the screen. I knew this was wrong. He was Mark's colleague, a married man. But there was something intoxicating about his attention, something that made me want to keep reading, keep responding. That evening, Mark mentioned James in passing. "James really enjoyed meeting you," he said casually as we cleared the table after dinner. "He said you're very smart for your age." I froze for a split second, my face burning. Did Mark know? Could he tell? But he didn't even look at me, just kept stacking plates. That night, I lay in bed, staring at my phone. James hadn't texted again, but his earlier messages replayed in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something that could explode if I wasn't careful. And then, just as I was about to put my phone down, it buzzed again. "I can't stop thinking about you, Emma. I hope that doesn't scare you." I didn't reply. I couldn't. But that didn't stop my heart from pounding. The next few days were a blur of emotions. Part of me wanted to tell Mark to put an end to this before it spiraled out of control. But another part of me, a darker, more curious part, wanted to see how far James was willing to go. And trust me, I had no idea just how far that would be. The morning after James's last text, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread and excitement churning in my stomach. I'd left him on read, hoping he'd get the hint and stop messaging me. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I actually wanted him to stop. That afternoon, as I was scrolling through my phone, another notification popped up. This time, it wasn't just a text. It was a picture. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the notification. My mind was racing. What could it be? I had a sinking feeling that I already knew. When I finally opened it, my heart dropped. It was a photo of James, shirtless, standing in front of a mirror. His expression was confident, almost smug, like he knew exactly what he was doing. The caption read, "Couldn't help myself. You've been on my mind all day." I stared at the image, unable to look away, but also unable to process what I was feeling. Shock. Embarrassment? Curiosity? I knew I had to respond, but what could I even say? Part of me wanted to call him out, tell him to stop. Another part of me, the part one wasn't proud of, wanted to play along just to see what he would do next. "James, this isn't appropriate," I typed, my fingers trembling. His reply came almost instantly. "Maybe not, but I can't stop thinking about you. You're incredible, Emma. I've never felt this way before." I felt my face flush as I read his words. There it was again, that intoxicating attention, the kind that made me feel special, desired. But it also made me feel dirty, like I was crossing a line I could never uncross. I decided to leave him on read again, hoping he'd take the hint. But, of course, he didn't. The next morning, I woke up to another message. "Good morning, beautiful. Hope you slept well. I know I did thinking about you." This time, I couldn't ignore it. I had to confront him, set boundaries. "James, you're married. This isn't okay. Please stop messaging me." I wrote, my hands shaking. His response caught me completely off guard. "My marriage is complicated. You wouldn't understand. My wife and I were basically strangers living in the same house. But you make me feel alive again, Emma." I didn't know what to say. How do you respond to something like that? He was pouring his heart out, or at least that's how it seemed. That evening during dinner, I could barely look at Mark. Every time he mentioned James's name, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. If only he knew what was happening behind his back. But the thing that scared me the most wasn't Mark finding out. It was the fact that, deep down, I didn't want James to stop. A few days later, James sent me another text. "I need to see you again, Emma. Not as Mark's colleague. Just as a man who can't get you out of his head." I should have said no. I should have blocked his number, told Mark, done something to end this. But instead, I agreed. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, far enough away that no one would recognize us. When I walked in, James was already there, waiting for me. He stood up as soon as he saw me, flashing that same confident smile that had captivated me during dinner. "You look beautiful," he said, pulling out a chair for me. I sat down, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The conversation started out light, almost casual. He asked about my classes, my hobbies, my plans for the future. But then his tone shifted. "You're incredible, Emma. Do you know that?" he said, leaning in closer. "You have no idea how much I've been looking forward to this." I didn't know how to respond. His words were flattering, but they also felt heavy, like they carried a weight I wasn't ready to bear. "I don't know if this is a good idea," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why not?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. "Life is short, Emma. Too short to ignore what makes you happy." I looked away, unable to hold his gaze. Was he right? Was I overthinking this? Before I could say anything else, he reached across the table and took my hand in his. His touch was warm, steady, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world faded away. "I don't want to pressure you," he said softly, "but I can't pretend I don't feel this connection. And I think you feel it too." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, guilt, excitement, fear, desire. When the meeting ended, James walked me to my car. As we stood there in the dim light of the parking lot, he leaned in, his face just inches from mine. "I hope this isn't the last time I see you," he said, his voice low and full of longing. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. As I drove home, my thoughts were racing. What had I just done? What was I getting myself into? And yet, despite all the guilt and uncertainty, I couldn't deny the truth. I wanted to see him again. And that was just the beginning. James didn't stop texting. If anything, our conversations became more intense, more personal. It started subtly, him asking about my day, sharing small details about his. But then he began opening up in a way that felt intimate. One evening, after a string of lighthearted texts, he sent something that caught me completely off guard. "Can I be honest with you about something?" I stared at the screen, unsure of what was coming. "Sure," I replied hesitantly. There was a pause before his next message came through. "My marriage, it's not what it seems. On the outside, people think we're this perfect couple. But the truth is, we've been drifting apart for years. She barely notices me anymore." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me felt sorry for him, but another part of me wondered why he was telling me this. "Why me?" "That sounds really hard, James," I typed back, keeping my tone neutral. "It is," he replied quickly. "You have no idea what it's like to feel invisible in your own home. But then I met you and,
I don't know, Emma.
you make me feel seen." His words sent a jolt through me. They were heavy, laced with emotion, and I didn't know how to process them. Was he being genuine, or was this just another line? I tried to steer the conversation back to something lighter, but James didn't let up. Over the next few days, he continued to share more about his unhappy marriage. "She doesn't even look at me anymore," he wrote one night. "I feel like I'm just a paycheck to her. But with you, I feel alive again." His messages left me feeling conflicted. On one hand, I knew this was wrong.
He was married.
He was Mark's colleague. This whole situation was a disaster waiting to happen. But on the other hand, his attention was intoxicating. It made me feel special, wanted, in a way I'd never experienced before. And then, one evening, he crossed a line I didn't even know existed. It was late, and I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when his message came through. "I want to show you something," it read. Before I could respond, another notification popped up. It was a photo. My heart raced as I opened it. The image was explicit. James, standing in front of a mirror, his shirt off, his expression confident and unapologetic. "I hope this isn't too much," his message read. "I just couldn't stop thinking about you." I was frozen. My mind was racing, a mix of shock, embarrassment, and, if I'm being completely honest, curiosity. I knew I should have been outraged, disgusted even. But instead, I felt something I wasn't proud of. Intrigue. I stared at the photo, unsure of what to do. Should I confront him? Block him? Tell Mark?
But I didn't do any of those things.
Instead, I replied, "James, this is inappropriate," I wrote, my hands trembling. "I know," he replied almost instantly. But I couldn't help myself. "You're just so beautiful, Emma. I've never felt this way about anyone before." His words sent a chill down my spine. There was something thrilling about his attention, something that made me feel powerful and desired. But it also made me feel dirty, like I was complicit in something I knew was wrong. I considered ending it right there, telling him to leave me alone. But I didn't. Instead, I let the conversation continue. Over the next few days, James's messages became even more personal. He told me about his struggles at work, his dreams, his regrets. He painted a picture of a man who felt trapped, unappreciated, and desperate for connection. And the more he opened up, the harder it became for me to pull away. One night, he sent another photo. This one wasn't as explicit, but it was still intimate. A close-up of his face, his eyes staring directly into the camera. "I wish I could see you right now," his message read. I stared at the photo, my emotions a tangled mess of guilt and excitement. "What are we doing, James?" I typed back. "I don't know," he replied. "But I can't stop."
Can you?
His question hung in the air, daring me to answer.
But I didn't know how.
I was too far in, too wrapped up in the thrill of it all. I knew this wasn't going to end well. But for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. And that terrified me. James and I began flirting openly in our messages. What had started as subtle compliments turned into something much bolder. He knew exactly what to say to make me feel special, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. "Good morning, beautiful," he texted one day. "I couldn't stop thinking about you last night." "You're incredible, Emma." I knew it was wrong. I knew I should have stopped responding, but his attention was addictive. Each message made me feel seen, desired, and important in a way I hadn't felt before. James had a confidence about him that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't pushy, but his words carried weight. He always knew how to say just enough to keep me hooked without pushing me too far. One evening, after a particularly flirty exchange, he sent a message that made my heart stop. "I want to see you again," he wrote. "But not as Mark's colleague. Just you and me." I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. Meeting him in person felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I could come back from. But at the same time, the thought of seeing him again filled me with a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. "It's risky," I replied. "Life's too short not to take risks," he shot back. "You're worth it, Emma. Tell me you don't feel the same." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Deep down, I knew this was a bad idea. But there was a part of me, a part one didn't want to admit existed, that wanted to say yes. "Okay," I finally typed. "But it has to be somewhere far from here." The next day, we met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It was quiet, tucked away, the kind of place where no one would recognize us. I arrived first, my heart racing as I sat at a corner table, glancing nervously at the door. When James walked in, he spotted me immediately. He smiled, that same confident, knowing smile that had drawn me in the first time we met. "You look stunning," he said as he sat down across from me. I blushed, looking down at my hands. "Thanks," I muttered, feeling both flattered and self-conscious under his gaze. For the first few minutes, we made small talk. He asked about my classes, my hobbies, my plans for the future. But there was an energy between us, an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. "You know," he said, leaning in slightly, "I've been looking forward to this all week. Just being here with you, it feels right." I felt my cheeks flush as his words washed over me. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at me, that made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. "James," I started, my voice shaky. "This is complicated." "Complicated, but worth it," he said without hesitation. "You're worth it, Emma. Don't you feel it too?" I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I did feel it. There was an undeniable chemistry between us, something that was impossible to ignore.
But it also terrified me.
As the conversation continued, James's charm became even more evident. He complimented me constantly in ways that felt genuine and personal. "You're so much more than just beautiful," he said at one point. "You're smart, funny, kind, you have this light about you that's impossible to ignore." His words made my heart race. No one had ever spoken to me like that before, with such intensity and sincerity. By the time we finished our coffee, the tension between us was almost unbearable. As we stood outside the cafe, James turned to me, his expression serious. "I don't want this to end," he said softly. "Being with you, it feels like everything I've been missing." I looked away, my mind racing. I knew we were crossing a line, but I couldn't deny how I felt. "James, this is dangerous," I whispered. "Sometimes the best things in life are," he replied, stepping closer. For a moment, I thought he was going to kiss me. And for a moment, I wanted him to. But instead, he reached out and gently touched my hand. "I won't push you," he said, "but I hope you'll let me see you again." I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. As I drove home, my emotions were a whirlwind. I knew this was wrong. I knew I was playing with fire. But the truth was, I didn't want it to stop. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Our meetings became more frequent. At first, it was just coffee shops or long drives far from home, places where no one could recognize us. James had a way of making every encounter feel thrilling, like we were the only two people in the world. The way he spoke to me, looked at me, it was as if he could see straight into my soul. But with every meeting, the line we had already crossed began to blur further. He would brush his hand against mine, linger a little too long when he hugged me goodbye. And I let him. One evening, we met at a small inn, tucked away on the outskirts of town. James had suggested it, saying we'd have more privacy. I knew what it meant, what he was implying, but I agreed anyway. My heart was pounding the entire drive there, a mix of anticipation and fear gripping me. When I arrived, James was already waiting. He greeted me with that same magnetic smile, but there was something different in his eyes that night, something deeper, more intense. We spent hours talking in the cozy room he had booked, the dim light casting a warm glow over everything. He was so attentive, so present, hanging on my every word as if nothing else mattered. And for a while, I let myself believe that was true. At some point, the space between us became too small to ignore. He reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my cheek. "You're incredible, Emma," he whispered, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I don't know how I got so lucky to find you." Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but it quickly deepened. I felt my breath catch as every part of me screamed that this was a mistake, that I needed to stop. But I didn't. The night unfolded like something out of a dream. He was tender, patient, and attentive, constantly asking if I was okay, if I wanted to keep going. And I said yes over and over again, because in that moment, I wanted to believe that this was something real. When it was over, we lay side by side, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a blanket. James held me close, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on my arm. "I don't ever want this to end," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I didn't reply. I couldn't. My mind was already spiraling, guilt clawing at the edges of my thoughts. The next morning, I woke up before him. The sunlight streaming through the window felt harsh, intrusive, as if it were exposing every mistake I had made the night before. I sat up, pulling the sheet around me, and stared at James as he slept peacefully beside me. For a moment, I felt a pang of affection, but it was quickly overshadowed by something else, regret. What had I done? James stirred, his eyes fluttering open as he smiled at me. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, his voice still heavy with sleep. I forced a smile, but my chest felt tight. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed, that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. On the drive home, my thoughts were a chaotic mess. I felt a pang of guilt every time I thought about Mark and my mom, about the trust one had betrayed. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the small flicker of satisfaction I felt knowing that I had become so important to James, that I had filled a void in his life. The following days were unbearable. James continued to text me, his messages filled with affection and promises.
But something had shifted inside me.
The thrill that had once been so intoxicating now felt suffocating. I began to question everything, his intentions, his sincerity, whether he truly cared about me or if I was just an escape from his unhappy marriage. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I might have been fooling myself all along. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a new fear crept into my mind. What if someone found out? What if James decided to tell Mark, or worse, use our relationship against me? The thought made my stomach churn. I couldn't let that happen. The weight of what we had done, of what I had allowed to happen, was becoming too much to bear. And for the first time, I began to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. But the worst part, deep down, I wasn't sure if I was ready to let it all go. The guilt was unbearable. Every time I saw Mark or my mom, it felt like their trust was a weight pressing down on my chest. The secret I carried with me grew heavier with each passing day, and the reality of what I'd done started to sink in. But James didn't seem to feel the same. If anything, he acted like nothing had changed. He continued texting me, acting as if our night together had only brought us closer. "Good morning, beautiful," he'd write, as though nothing about our situation was wrong. "Thinking about you as always." At first, I tried to distance myself. My replies became shorter, less enthusiastic. But James didn't take the hint. If anything, he became more persistent. One evening, I finally told him that I couldn't do this anymore. "James, we need to stop," I texted, my hands shaking as I typed. "This isn't right." It never was. His response came almost immediately. Stop? After everything we've shared? You can't be serious, Emma. I am serious, I replied. This has gone too far. I can't keep lying to Mark and my mom. It's over. There was a long pause before his next message came through. You think you can just walk away from this? From me? Do you have any idea what I've risked for you? I felt a chill run down my spine. His words felt more like a threat than an expression of heartbreak. What are you saying? I typed, my heart pounding. You don't want me to tell Mark, do you? He wrote. Because I will if you force my hand. I stared at the screen, the room spinning around me. Was he serious? Would he really expose everything just to keep me tied to him? Panic set in. I couldn't let him control me like this, but I also couldn't let him destroy my family. I felt trapped, cornered, like there was no way out. But then I realized something. I wasn't powerless. I had the texts, the photos, the proof of everything James had done. If he wanted to play dirty, I could fight back. It was risky, but it was the only option I had left. The next day, while Mark was out in the backyard working on his car, I approached him, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. Mark, I said, my voice trembling. I need to talk to you about something. It's important. He looked up, concern flashing across his face. What's wrong, Emma? I hesitated, my heart pounding so loudly. I thought he might hear it. It's about James, I said finally. He's not who you think he is. Mark frowned, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped closer. What are you talking about? I took a deep breath and handed him my phone. You need to see this. For the next few minutes, Mark scrolled through the messages and photos, his expression growing darker with each passing second. By the time he looked up, his face was a mix of anger and disbelief. Are you telling me this has been going on behind my back? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I'm sorry, Mark. I didn't know how to tell you. But he's been threatening me. I didn't know what else to do. Mark didn't say another word. He stormed back into the house, his phone in hand, and I followed, my heart in my throat. Over the next few hours, I watched as Mark went to work dismantling James's life. He forwarded the evidence to their company's HR department, detailing how James had used his position of power to manipulate and harass me. He also contacted James's wife, sending her the photos and messages as proof of his infidelity. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within days, James was fired from his job. His once stellar reputation in the company was completely destroyed, and his wife filed for divorce almost immediately. As for me, I was left to pick up the pieces of my own life. Mark was furious with me, not just for what had happened with James, but for keeping it a secret for so long. Our relationship, which had always been distant but cordial, became tense and strained. My mom didn't say much, but the disappointment in her eyes was unmistakable. I had thought exposing James would bring me some sense of relief, but instead, it left me feeling hollow and broken. Yes, I had stopped him from controlling me, but at what cost? Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of what had happened. My reputation was in tatters, my relationships with Mark and my mom were forever changed, and I couldn't shake the guilt that clung to me like a shadow. James was out of my life, but the damage he had caused and the mistakes I had made were things I would carry with me for a long time. Looking back, I don't know if I made the right choice, but at the time, it felt like the only one I had. After everything came to light, nothing was ever the same. Mark barely looked at me anymore, and when he did, it was with an expression I couldn't bear, disappointment and anger mixed with something worse, distrust. I told him the truth, every ugly detail. I thought that would fix things, or at least give me a chance to start over. But instead, it only created a distance between us that felt impossible to bridge. Conversations became cold and short. The warmth that once made our home feel safe was gone. I could see it in my mom's eyes too. She didn't say much, but the silent tension in the air spoke louder than any words. And James? He was gone just like that. His career destroyed, his marriage in ruins, and yet, somehow, I was the one left dealing with the wreckage. It felt like he had moved on, while I was stuck in the aftermath of decisions I couldn't undo. I replayed everything in my mind over and over. What if I'd done something differently? What if I'd never answered that first message? What if I'd stayed silent and let James continue his games? But that's the thing about mistakes. You can't rewrite them. They stick with you, a constant reminder of what you've lost. The hardest part wasn't losing Mark's trust, though that stung more than I could ever admit. It was realizing that my actions had caused chaos in so many lives, including my own. I wanted to go back, to undo everything, but life doesn't work that way. As I sit here now, telling this story, I can't help but wonder, did I do the right thing? Should I have stayed silent and avoided all this destruction? Or was exposing James the only way to stop him from hurting others? This is the part where I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed quiet, or would you have risked everything to tell the truth? Let me know in the comments. I really need to know if I made the right call. And that's it. That's my story. Or maybe it's just the beginning of the consequences I'll have to live with. What do you think?